Today I'm talking with John J. Lennon, an incarcerated journalist whose work has appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Esquire, the New York Times Magazine. He's been twice a finalist for the National Magazine Award, and his essays have been anthologized in the Best American Magazine Writing. Lennon is serving his 24th year at Sing Sing Correctional Facility, and his new book, The Tragedy of True Crime, is unlike anything else in the genre. It's the first person account of a man who has killed, writing about the lives of other men who have killed. Through their stories and his own, Lennon asks us to reconsider what we think we know about true crime, punishment, and the search for redemption. It's a rare opportunity to hear from someone who is writing with both journalistic rigor and lived experience. Here's my conversation with John J. Lennon. Let's update listeners and just sort of give a brief bio on not the reasons why you're incarcerated, but where did you find the passion for writing and where did you discover writing as a talent of yours while incarcerated?
Yeah, so I guess I've always liked story, even when I was running around as a criminal in Brooklyn. I would always get sucked up in story. But eventually, I went away for in 2001. I killed a man, and ultimately, I was sentenced 28 years to life. I had 25 to life for the murder, and I had other charges that ran consecutive. So that's how I wound up. I had selling drugs, carrying guns. And eventually, I wound up with that term of 28 years to life. And when I was in Attica, maybe in like 2010s, I was fortunate to sort of land in a creative writing workshop, and it was really geared towards nonfiction, narrative writing, creative writing, essay writing, and that's where I got the writing bug. It's where it kind of showed me what good writing looked like. I was, you're kind of on your own in prison. A lot of us come in, myself included, very uneducated. So but a lot of the teaching and where I started leaning towards the genre or the style in which I really pursued was really just getting a lot of magazines, ordering a lot of magazines. In the workshop, we were sort of reading best American essay collections, and I kind of like started ordering the magazines from which those collections had reprinted essays, and I kind of went from there, and I kind of taught myself the style of first person journalism pretty much in my cell, just reading long form articles. So that's how it came to be in Attica, teaching myself to be a magazine journalist. And a fun fact was that they had like a bit of a stupid directive that it was really difficult to send a prisoner books because the package room guards were sort of misinterpreting a directive. It's usually like that. I think a lot of the directives in prison, the prison system, are poorly written. So they had a hard time. We had a hard time receiving books. So my mother would send me magazine subscriptions, which would come with the regular mail, and I became it was kind of by happenstance. I became really it's one of the factors that played into me becoming a magazine writer.
And since then, you've been published in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Esquire, and the New York Times Magazine. After publishing so many articles in all these major magazines, what made you feel that this book needed to be written? The Tragedy of True Crime.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I kind of write about things that I experience, and in 2018, I experienced, CNN producers had reached out to me and they told me that they wanted to sort of like do a redemption documentary on my life, and I was like, cool, like let's do it. And they had just kind of misled me on the name of the show, and so I was doing this work, and I know who I was when I came to prison. I was an awful person. I'm not proud of the things I did, but that was 18 years prior to when I had spoke to these folks. So I actually believed them. I actually believed them when they said, we're really interested in how you turned your life around. But it turned out to be they lied to me about the name of the show, when the show aired, it was. I mean, they did capture who I'd become, but it was majority of a recounting and reenactments of my crime. It was very hard to watch. I wound up watching it on a TV in my cell. Others were watching it, and it really hit me to this whole genre of true crime that was happening at the same time. Really, criminal justice coverage was happening, and I was like, what is going on here? How do I wind up on a show called Inside Evil 18 years after my crime? And when my crime, was fresh, it wasn't even a second thought for the media. They didn't even cover it. It was a couple of tabloid articles, but I was like, so what's happening? So I really became intrigued about true crime, and I started writing critical articles, and eventually, it was so I was critiquing, the true crime industry on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I was like, maybe I could do it better. Maybe I could tell fuller stories about my peers, and so that's kind of how the book came about.
And you are following other folks who are incarcerated with you, and you have obviously a unique perspective because it's a first person account. You're writing about the lives of other men who also have killed through your stories and their own stories. Now, in that, in reporting, you weave your story and the stories of other men who have killed. What has been sort of the hardest part of balancing your own stories with theirs?
I mean, it's finding a way to sort of relate to them. I don't know. It's finding a way where I can enter the narrative where it's furthering our story. So if I think a first person journalist really has to think twice about when they're writing about others, how much their story is necessary to tell these other stories. Fortunately for a lot of journalists, they don't carry the weight that I carry, which is also having killed the man, my subjects. Not all of them killed men, but I mean, the point is, I don't carry. I carry something different than most journalists. So it's. Hold on a second. Just want to mute this for a second. The TA is right next to myself. Sorry, sorry about that. That's a little texture in the background for the listeners. So New York State prisoners have tablet phones, which is a little easier. The previous interviews we did, when I was in another prison, I would be in the yard. It's a little bit more convenient, but the background music sometimes is, or the background atmospheric sort of noises can be a bit much. Sometimes I have a PA speaker right by my cell. But yeah, so it was about, just to finish up on that question. It was about sort of when my story was needed in the narrative to sort of maybe illuminate just some of the issues around other stories and how can I relate to the person I'm writing about. So if it was, I don't know if that was the hard part, but it's always hard knowing like where are to sort of transition your own story into the stories of those you write about.
You just mentioned it a little while ago. You being incarcerated and this sort of boom in true crime. And I think the book challenges the way true crime is usually told. What do you think gets lost when the public assumes crime as entertainment?
But what gets lost is what happens to the person who committed the crime after the judgment, after the sentence. They go away, but there's this whole other part of the story that unfolds. Milton Jones, one of my characters in the story, he was 17 years old. He suffered from some disabilities growing up, intellectual disabilities. He grew up in a poor neighborhood in the 80s, and a young black man, and he struggled. And I think, after he committed this crime, he went away. And so at 17 years old, to when I meet him at 50 years old, so he committed this crime in 1987, right? So I meet him when he's 50 years old, pursuing a master's degree in theology. And Milton is at 17 years old, he participated in a double murder of two priests with another teenager. But I think when you looked him up, even before I wrote about him, like there's a huge gap in his story from 17 to 50, and it's a pretty inaccessible gap. That's really all the guys I write about. I would say that this applies to Michael Shane Hale, who in 1995, at 23, killed his 63-year-old lover. It was a toxic relationship, and when he went away, I meet him when he's many years later, in 2018, 17, I meet him for the first time. So there's a lot of this like inaccessible space, and it's the same with Robert Chambers. I think whenever, he's probably the most sort of infamous character, true crime celebrity, although I'm sure he doesn't appreciate that title. When we think of, he's had to sort of live with monikers like the preppy killer and all this kind of stuff. What's that feel like? What's that look like when at 18 years old you kill a girl in the park and you become this iconic true time figure? And then what does his whole life look like? What's it like to be sort of to be serving time in prison and to have all these narratives about you? So I mean, I just thought each of the characters, there was a part of their story that was untold. And if you're asking me what true crime is missing, I would say in large part is that.
Yeah, and talking about Shane, reading his story, when you write about Shane's background, it really highlights the trauma and circumstances that sort of shaped his path to where he is now, or leading up to when he got incarcerated. Do you think the public underestimates the role of environment in violent crime?
The environment's about how you're growing up and how your
Yeah,
environment,
yeah. Because if you look at
sort of
Shane's
promotes
yeah, if you
violence.
look at Shane's story and the abuse that he faced as a young boy, and him being a gay man and struggling with their identity, it almost when I was reading it, it almost sort of like, I'll be honest with you, it sort of broke my heart that this person had to go through all this, and you makes you wonder automatically. Maybe this is naive of me, but makes you wonder automatically that, wow, if there's only was a person who may have stepped in and helped Shane through his time, maybe he wouldn't have ended up incarcerated. But when you bring his background into it, it's almost, you can see how it sort of shaped him to where he was, to the point where gets incarcerated. Do you feel that sort of the public sort of underestimates the role of someone's upbringing and the environment they're in can lead to a violent crime life?
Sure. I mean, look, I think, those are what's called in legal terms mitigating factors. Mitigation, like what drove him to this point? Like what was his life like up until the point that he killed Stefan, which is the name of his lover at the time. And yeah, I mean, I think in his situation, in terms of a societal sort of, I mean, he grew up in Kentucky, a young man who's gay, and that's very difficult in the '70s, growing up in Kentucky, really anywhere. But eventually, he's sort of at 19 years old, he sort of rises to New York City, and with all that grief and all that rejection, he wants to find his people. What happens is he continues to be used as sort of fresh faced, good looking boy who has no means, and he continues to be sort of taken advantage of, even though sometimes prosecutors made it look like he was taking advantage of others, but he wasn't like some robust sex worker. He was trying to get by. I would say, all of our backstories are quite relevant to where we are at that moment in time that we make that decision. I think it's a little, so it's the rejection of the world is rejecting change, and there's a lot of anger in that. With Milton, I think there was intellectual sort of disabilities, and just growing up in a very poor, difficult neighborhood. He saw violence, in his household when he was younger with his uncles, and try to flesh that out with Milton. I mean, it was a very positive community, and I think what throws people a curve is, Robert Childers' crime, and I try to do that on purpose. They're not all sort of, suffering from the awful backstory. I think that's a lot of the reason why people resent Robert Chambers, is because he did not have an awful backstory. But there was a societal time in the '80s, growing up in Manhattan, where young kids were on the Upper East Side, where they weren't really affected by the gang wars from the '80s and Harlem and the Lower East Side and all these sort of wild neighborhoods. But he was in the safe Upper East Side, and when he killed Jennifer Levin in the park, he was a very good-looking young man, and people didn't really couldn't answer that question that you're asking. Like, what are the factors, and do some people dismiss those? And that's kind of like, why his case was head scratching. I like to think I explored some of that in the book. And with my case, and mine is more traditional. I also grew up in very seedy neighborhoods in Hell's Kitchen. And I was very captivated by gangsters, father figure. I relate to Milton a lot with that. So, so all that sort of plays a part. I think it should be offered for context, not sort of to rationalize our crimes. But I think to get the full story, I think you should drop back and sort of learn how somebody grows up. And that's why I try to structure the book the way I do. I meet them in prison, and through that meeting in current time, I drop back and tell the stories of their lives, and then we get to the crime. And I sort of weave my own crime through some of theirs when I get to that crime stage, and I try to unpack that, what we were thinking. You can't nonfiction, right? You can't really crawl into somebody's head, but when you share the same experience, unfortunately, you can offer what's in your head. So that's another sort of reason of how I render my own experiences alongside my subjects.
Yeah, and talking about the structure, that I'm glad you brought that up because I felt like almost sort of like a fly on the wall of the meet. If you were meeting, let's say Shane, for example, like you meeting Shane, and how that happened. It happens like an organic meeting. You don't know the person at first. So, you explain how folks meet, and then as you get to know Shane yourself, we get to know Shane ourselves, and I feel I do like that style that you chose to write this book in, and so it almost feels like organic, almost feels like we're there with you as you find out about Shane.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was, with any narrative writer, I mean, structure is very important. Like, where are we going to start the story? I think typical true crime stories, I think we all know, and all the listeners know too. It's like when you watch I mean, in terms of structure, when you watch a show about murder like that, it usually starts in medias res, they call it, a storyteller, which is like right up before things everything unravels, right? It's this crescendo moment in the story, and it's usually the murder. You hear 911 calls, you hear action, you may hear some gunshots. I mean, it's frankly, pretty cheesy. You see one true crime, so you've seen them all. But obviously, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to make it authentic, but also gritty too. I'm not shying away from what we did, and we'll get to that. A slow burn to that, and I think there's intention with the way people structure their stories, and that's the sort of beef that I do have with traditional true crime. It's just like, dude, to what end are you telling the story generations later? And then you're just like opening this story, and then now it's fresh in the minds of people that hadn't even known about this. Like for example, like Robert Chambers' story. Like I remember his case back when it happened. I was very young. But it was sensational. It was all over. It was like the OJ of the time in the 80s. It was like one of those big, it was probably the first case like that. But I remember I'd seen it in 2020 before I had transferred to a prison and would meet him. And I was actually interviewing Milton at the time. And I came up, and somebody, my neighbor, I think, told me, like, there's a docu-series on about Robert Sanders. And I was like, wow, that was like 33 years ago. Like, why is there a multi-night docu-series about this guy's crime? And he was in prison. And I was like, Matt, I wonder what that's like for him to have the whole cell block watching his life. And I would find out, because right after that, I would transfer and land with him. And I explained that in the book. So there's these little things that happen. There's things like that my access allows me to sort of tell these stories that what happens to my peers. And when you set those scenes, look, whenever people do the things that we did, it's very difficult to sort of like render folks as sympathetic characters, right? But when you tell the full story and you explain these things that people probably wouldn't even think of, I think if people were giving it a fair read, they'd be like, wow, that's not cool. That's pretty awesome. I would like to think. And so that's what I did with Rob. It was a risky character. I think that's it.
Yeah. Well, let's bring listeners to on how you write while incarcerated. You're writing. I mean, in the past, you mentioned that sometimes it was as handwritten notes, but a lot of times is tapping on your tablet these stories.
Well, I mean, like any journalist, I'm gonna have. Well, I wouldn't say any journalist, but I don't have like tape recorder or anything like that. So usually, I'm a little spoiled with my characters. Oftentimes, I live with them, my subjects, and so I get to observe them when sometimes they don't even know. We live with each other. So with Rob, for example, with Shane, with Milk, and all my characters, I spend time with them. I see how they treat others. I see how others treat them, and that's kind of an edge that other journalists don't have, right? Even journalists, when you're going, it's immersive, right? You're living with the person. It's not always like, all right, let's sit down. Let me whip my pad out and tell me about your younger, more vulnerable years. It's a little more fluid than that. And in fact, I try not to like whip out my pad in the yard and or it's a little uncomfortable, right? To do that and to like my style is like a lot of like Dave Paris's he's a famous Esquire writer. You observe a lot when I'm sort of talking to a subject. Sometimes I'm just talking to them. Maybe when they like maybe I'll write a few things down that I know I have to capture that like quote, jot it down real quick. But you try not to sort of like have the pad open. It's kind of like hanging out style of journalism, very magazine style of lead journalism. And then later on, I would go in my cell and sort of type up the notes and kind of be a little organized about my interviews. But a lot of stuff was observation too. But yeah, when we got the technology in prison, I got the book deal in 2021, but we started getting these. We got these tablets, and it was really helpful. Before that, I worked on a typewriter with a very limited memory. A lot of dictating with my magazine pieces to people who would help me on the outside. Now it's mostly my publicist, Megan Pasco. I work with a lot of my book publishers, but we work on a lot of freelance articles together. You kind of need, but that's the process. Kind of need folks on the outside to develop relationships, professional relationships. The process is quite a tricky one. But yeah, the technology certainly enabled me to. I wrote the book, and much of the book is draft as I explained in the author's process. In the draft section of this tablet, and they have these like rubber keyboards that you could plug in and that you could buy from the company, this prison communications company, which is pretty controversial because they charge us for things. But like it had enabled me, it has enabled me to send emails. I mean, all this stuff is scrutinized. All this, it's very difficult. Sometimes my messages don't go there, but it beats a blank. It beats dictating over the phone when you're on deadline. It beats, I'll take it. So yeah, I mean, the new technology in prison. I mean, I never thought when I came to prison 24 years ago that I'd be on the phone right now in my cell because there's a phone function on the tablet too. Most recently, they put that on last year. So I never thought I'd be doing like an interview with myself right now, talking to you, but I am. So the technology has helped.
You know, I was reading. I was wondering. You're writing about men like Robert Chambers, Milton Jones, and Michael Shane Hale. Has that experience expand or change your understanding of crime and its consequences?
I mean, all of our crimes are are sort of motivated by different factors, but all of them are also very far-reaching. Um, so I guess the answer to that question is like when I write about others and see, like for example, I think a lot of times when you go to prison, like I did, you don't want to think about sort of what you did, and there are no programs to sort of help you sort of come to terms. And often, what I used to do, and what many of us, we rationalize. We get together, we hang out, and we charge it to the game, so to speak. There's ways that you can that we often rationalize because who wants to be the villain? I think with writing, for me, it prompted me to be honest with myself because look, readers can see through the voice on the page. But this guy's probably fake. This guy's being honest with himself. I'm not listening to anything this guy tells me. But I think so. So with journalism talking, I think that's how you frame these questions. Because when I start learning other stories, when I start learning about other stories and how they came with their crimes and maybe things that have happened with their crimes, like for example in Milton's case, Milton's brother, with one of the brothers to the priest, Ray Bissonette, the Milton killed the priest and Father Joseph Bissonette, one of the priests. So his brother Ray Bissonette came to see Milton because he wanted answers after the trial. He just kind of popped up and with his wife and visited Milton. And Milton was grateful and took full accountability over it. But I saw how that affected. I got to sort of see how far-reaching it was, and when reporting out this book, I never got to engage or apologize face to face or any of that with Scientific. They don't want anything to do with it, which is totally understandable. But doing this work, I was able to see, and I interviewed Ray, and I don't want to give a lot of the book away. It could be really difficult to explain at this point, but a lot of complications had happened with that relationship between the brother. He Ray loved his brother, and he looked up to his brother. That was his older brother, the priest, Father Joe. So I interviewed him, and I learned some things, and where in what other states really am I engaging like that? Because the system doesn't enable it. So I'm pursuing this career, and in this space, I'm reaching out. I'm a journalist. I'm seeing, what is the victim thing? It was a very difficult part of the book to reach out to folks who've been devastated by the murder, the killings that my character committed, but it helped me. I obviously had empathy for these folks, and put me in a pretty uncomfortable because I'm not a traditional journalist. I'm one who's also so I appreciate the grace of the people who spoke here for this book. So it's things like that that you learn through the work of reporting that you otherwise wouldn't have sort of engaged with if I was just a guy serving time for my crime and just doing time for murder. Like there's none of that. So I'd like to think that some of that was in terms of the consequences of our crimes and how far-reaching societally and for the victims that that by reporting out my subjects, I can almost experience some type of I learn a lot, and I think it's an important part of the book.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about that in your book about your own crime and the effects that it has on the family of the victim. And you feel the tension, and telling stories that will that will bring you recognition and potentially income. I don't know how that works, but knowing that your victim's family exist, how do you talk about this in the book a little bit, but if you want to just give us a sort of preview, how do you sit with that dilemma of knowing how the victim's families feels about the whole situation, but knowing also you have to follow your passion and your writing, and you knowing that writing and the book will get recognition?
Yeah, I mean that's the personal conflict of all my writing, particularly in this book too. I carry it. I carry that tension, and I understand. I mean, I acknowledge in the book, like I totally try to, as much as I can, try to put myself in the sister of the man I killed, and I say that vaguely like that in a passive way because she asked me in an earlier sort of essay I wrote for the Washington Post about the process of coming to terms and writing an apology letter. She had written a letter to the Washington Post a few years before I wrote the book and said, yeah, please don't use my brother's name in your writing. And I respected that request in 2019. I respected it in the book too. It's a constant complication. It is the constant complication of my life. I don't know if I had the answer to what I what I necessarily you know, think or I'm supposed to feel about that. I mean, I think I tried. Yeah, it kind of has me exasperated. It's the question that I really have no clear answer to, frankly.
In this whole process of writing and putting this book together, did anything sort of surprise you in the process of doing this while being incarcerated? Did you learn that you anything sort of came out that you weren't expecting, maybe for yourself or just in the whole process of editing and writing?
Well, sure. I mean, I think the idea of the book. I think it's sort of we wanted to progress as the character stories progress, and I think I went in with just a lot of questions about true crime, and this wasn't a polemic. Like I wasn't proposing like this is a narrative driven book about the lives of three men and my own. And sure, we hit different themes, but there's so many different sort of like self discoveries that I've taken away. I mean, there's a progression in just my relationship with shame. There's this subculture in prison where somebody like Shane is gay, and he lived his whole life like that, and in prison, so he dealt with trauma of growing up in Kentucky, sexual abuse all over the place. He comes to New York, a lot of compounded trauma there, toxic relationships, crime, and then he comes to prison, and that is just like the last frontier for get right. And most people, they can't even wrap their head around it. But this is his life, and this is how he's lived. And I remember when I first encountered Shane, I would talk to him in doses. Like, I would be very aware, and as you have to be
Hmm.
in prison, of who you talk to and who you associate with. And I remember, so like, 'cause I don't want people gossiping around. I'm talking with a date. It's so, it's offensive even to sort of maybe for others to hear. But trust me, if you live in a subculture, it's quite understanding.
Hmm.
But as the book evolved, or as I evolved with the writing of the book, and I split up from Sharon, and I go to a different prison, and I come back, and I remember, like, I would always keep in touch with Sharon, and my publicist, Megan, she would, because you kind of gotta like double back on your characters, and just send messages to them, and you have to be resourceful. So Megan had developed her own relationship with Sharon, and we and who she and her mother too, who she comes to really adore. Shane. I mean, they have a very close relationship. But and I remember I, I remember like having I transferred back last year, and I remember the first time I saw him in the hallway. I just would we just kind of hugged, and it was a tight hug, and it was in the hallway, and everybody around, and it was I didn't care for a second what anybody thought, and I thought that in itself, just understanding this guy, I am not an objective journalist. I am. That is not. This is not newspaper man journalism. It is me immersed in experiencing things in the culture of prison with my subjects. And by the time I had met Shane, and I'm also living all the details of the story. And when I see it, I just so I like to think like that sort of my own personal sort of evolution of just like culture and just like transcending that. It's just like who cares? And that's just one example of personal sort of self discovery and sort of progress in my own character, I think, just from writing this book. But there's so many zooming out just about true crime, and you know just how it's the antithesis of this idea that often espoused in criminal justice circles that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. No, that if true crime is one thing, it's not that. It's saying no, like you are your crime. And in fact, we're gonna retell it a generation later, so the whole world knows who you are and what you did. And that's what true crime is. True crime is the antithesis to any of these sort of like sort of higher brow or sort of emotional, the empathetic spaces in reformists. And I wouldn't even just say reformists. I would just say most people have that empathy, and most people do believe in comebacks in America. But for some reason, in this true crime space, we are loving that worst part. That I mean, we go to sleep through it at night, and that's a problem. That's a problem, especially in this space when we're being told that crime is out of control and violence is out of control in this moment. And let me tell you something. I grew up in the '80s and early '90s in a housing project in Brooklyn, hearing gunshots. You know what I mean? And when I started coming out of the house in 1990, there were 2,200 murders in New York City. There's barely 300 this year. But if you listen to the news, that'll tell you otherwise. And if you go to sleep to murder watching true crime, that'll also tell you or make you feel, I imagine, some other things too. So I think this is an important book where you can sort of rap with somebody that did something shameful, but I'd like to think you could also trust. And and that's the gray area of this book, right? Nothing's black and white, and you get in the traditional people, good and evil. We're not doing that.
Has there been any reaction from the men that you feature in this book? knowing that you are writing about them in the past or currently when you were putting this book together? Because I'm assuming you would have to ask the permission or tell them like, hey, I'm writing about you in this article or things like that. What has been their reaction when they find out about things like that?
Yeah, my general rule is like if I'm going to mention you in the book, I run it by you, unless the person is a public figure. So if so if 2020 is recounting your crime and you're already out there and
Hmm.
date on it, and if I run into you and it's kind of like a quick encounter, I could, that's, you're a public figure. Actually, you're already out there. Like Robert, well, I did get Robert Taylor does talk to me and did agree to let me write about him, and as all the others. So I usually, yeah, not usually, I always get the permission of the folks that I write about. This is a deep dive, but even peripheral characters too. I like to let them know, like, hey, I'd like to feature you, and but most guys are with it. I think the question, I think when folks do engage with the work, eventually there is a little anxiety
Hmm.
attached with that. As anything, I'm a bit vulnerable about my own life in the book, my own fears, my own that don't really jibe well with sort of subculture norms of privileges, sexuality or whatever. Like there's a lot of, I would like to think, honest and vulnerable writing, and I do wonder. I am fearful, but that's the name of the game of writing. Sometimes people may not like how you render something, or may judge you for writing about something or revealing something. And but yeah, I mean, there's always anxiety about that, but I'm certainly not the only writer that has that. But I leave it on the page. That's the only thing I have. There's nothing else. So I have to leave it on the page.
We talked about true crime and sort of the explosion of true crime as entertainment. For this book, who do you imagine when you were writing it, or now that it's getting ready to be published officially? Who do you imagine your ideal reader is for this book?
I would like to think it's both. I would like to think it's the true crime aficionados that do like the style that I'm talking about and that I'm critiquing and offering. So I want those. I want. That's what I want. I think folks who follow my work, or readers who follow my work, my magazine writing. I mean, I think, of course, I would want them to read it too. So I mean, I think it's, like, to answer your question. I welcome a larger audience. I don't know if there's size in this. I try not to see the world through that lens so much, but yeah, I mean, I try to. I like to think it's for a very broad audience. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. In reading the book, you talk about redemption. You mentioned you mentioned it even in the beginning in the intro, Chris Cuomo and his show, and that was supposed to be something a story of redemption, but although came be other something else. So I was just curious when I was reading that, having the experience you have now, having being incarcerated for so long, writing these stories, now editing and writing the book. I just want to know, what does redemption mean to you now, and do you think your writing is part of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've spoken about this, before. I mean, for me, this style of writing is about truth. I think that in journalism, any journalist, sort of North Star is the truth. And I had to tell the truth about myself before I would tell the truth about others. So through writing, I've been able to, through this style of writing, I've been able to sort of self-discover on many different levels. So I mean, I think there was the work in itself, and sort of, sort of developing my craft has a sort of many redeemable qualities, especially when I'm not writing fantasy novels here. Very, very difficult. No, not the fantasy ones, but I'm writing sort of difficult stories about myself. And it's hard sort of telling the truth about yourself and coming to terms with the pretty ugly stuff, and then exploring that in others. But I also think the redeemable quality is like for many years I was learning this craft myself, and then for many years like guys would notice. You know, they read Men's Health, they read Sports Illustrated, they read Esquire, they read all their critics, and then they may say, I didn't like that, or you could have did this better or that better, and then sometimes they say, how do I do that? How do I how do I become a writer? How do I write about myself? It seems to be an interesting genre for sure. And in the last few years, I think I hosted a workshop, and with the help of my publishers, and when I was with Sullivan, the commissioner actually did the workshop, and there was like 10 guys in the workshop. This was last year before I came back to Sing Sing, and 8 of them got published. And one of the things we did in the workshop, and some of them got published, 8 of them, so it was quite a few, one even in the New York Times. So I try to encourage. I mean, a part of that style that I was teaching was the style that I taught myself, and a lot of that was learning to come clean, learning to self-discover. And I think that's a redeemable quality when you sort of gotten your own act together, but along the way, you're like, hey, man, like maybe this could work for you in this style. And as it turned out, it did. And a lot of guys in my workshop, not only got published, I mean, I think that's a huge accomplishment, but also they're really honest with themselves on the page. So, I mean, I don't know. Like, I think when we talk about redemption, we talk about getting our own act together, and we also talk about service. Because when you do the kind of things that we did, we owe, and I think I owe society, but part of owing society is helping those around you that are struggling too. So I think all of that is a testament to, I don't like to tout my own sort of redemption qualities, but I mean, I think that's been my experience, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned your workshop, and I remember the last time we spoke, that was something you were starting. At that time, you were at Sullivan Correctional Facility, but as we know, that there's been closures of the Sullivan County Correctional Facility and the prison strikes that were going on. What is the current status of your workshops? Did you start one up where you currently are now?
Yeah, well, I kind of recounted what happened with the workshop and telling how I came here and in a piece called "Finding the Story" in the New York Review of Books. That was a recent piece of mine. Because of the things you mentioned, the strike, and there's been a lot of turmoil in the New York prison system. And Sing Sing has always been a tough prison because it's big, it's the structure of it, the sort of staff, the low staffing. So no, it's slowly getting back to normal. But for the past year, I've generally been locking myself for 23 hours a day with 1 hour of rest. We're in a pretty fragile state of system right now for many different reasons. I remember reaching out to the commissioner when he got the post, and I said, you're coming in at a very tough time. I don't envy your position. Like both sides hate each other now. And that's a tough job. And I have to say, he's doing a good job. I like to, sort of give credit where credit is due. We all want to be affirmed. But I actually think he's trying the best he can in a very contentious situation. But yeah, I mean, the prison system right now is awful. But hopefully we'll turn this corner. But yeah, that's what my day to day is like. A lot of cell time.
Mm.
And there's no, I mean, I met with the librarian, a new librarian here, and they want, and then she wants to sort of pursue a workshop. We'll see what happens. I don't, it could be controversial, like, you know what I mean, sort of, approving a workshop with me. And yeah, I mean, a lot of administrators get pretty uneasy empowering me to help us. They don't know what they're going to get. This is not it's interesting, I didn't learn to be a journalist under a program with the prison newspaper. I think there's a lot of those in different prisons across America. There used to be actually so many, like prison newspapers and people in prison writing for them and learning, sort of reported chops. It was a cool sort of part of the prison culture. But today it's not like that. There are some newspapers that you can sort of learn this stuff, but none of that's really available in New York. So I've been a freelancer. I developed this on my own. So there's no me being part of a program and I'm sort of in communication with the superintendent or the administrators or, I kind of do my own thing. They know that. And I would like to think some respect that. but I also think it's a gamble. It's tough to build relationships with it because to be fair to them, they're like, this guy is like a prisoner and he's writing to these places, and it's just like I don't even know what I can say around this guy. So I can understand them probably thinking that, but I will say when the suit commissioner approved my workshop and he gave it to me for a brief period, I said I would like to think good things came from that. Nobody was sort of arbitrarily just coming after the system just because they could, and I think a lot of it came from that. But we'll see what happens in the future. Maybe we'll get a workshop going here and things, but certainly want a lot of interest.
Yeah, and I remember the feeling I got from you was that you were happy that this workshop was happening and you were leading it. It was almost like you were not like you almost like you were giving back to the information that you got, the feeling you got as becoming a writer, and it seemed like you wanted to sort of pass that along and sort of do that. So I hope it does come back in some capacity for you.
Yeah, I mean to be fair, like it's a tough time for the prison system right now. They're dealing with a lot of you know understaffing, and I try to give a fair analysis, and hopefully we'll see. Then maybe it will work out.
Yeah. Well, John, I think I have maybe one more question here. How do you want people to think differently about the men who commit crimes or sometimes violent crimes after reading your book?
Well, as you say, one of your questions suggests. I mean, like trying to get the fuller story. I mean, I think when folks read the book, I mean, they're going to see that there's a lot that happens before and after the crime that kind of offer more of a credible picture of who these guys are. So, I mean, I would hope the readers give us a fair shake and sort of come away from with a bit of a different feeling maybe than they come away from traditional true crime. And it's when we think of stories, we think of sympathetic character trying to overcome a complicated situation that he solves, right? But man, it's tough. It's tough for us all to be sympathetic characters that you all root for, and that's the tricky thing about writing about guilty people. And I don't write about the innocent people that say they're innocent. I write about the guilty, and I think that there's there can I hope that there's some kind of appreciation with some readers that see folks like myself and Milton and Shane and even Rob understanding how they carry what they did and how they come to terms with that or don't. Not everyone can express remorse in a crystallized way, perhaps even myself. But I hope I would hope I just would hope there's some sort of understanding and give us a bit more of a fair shake than when our stories are rendered in these other outlets. I mean, if anything, I think that's what any storyteller would want, just to evoke empathy. I think the world could use a bit more empathy these days, especially this nation.
Yeah, definitely. So, John, is there anything I haven't touched on that you want folks to know about your book?
Yeah, it's September 23rd. How I'm told, you can order it anywhere. The tragedy is true crime, and I hope you folks buy it and engage with it. Just thank you for your always thank you WJFS and all your listeners. I appreciate you. You've been very kind to me over the years in terms of your interest.
No, definitely.
So it's been fun. So thanks.
The tragedy of true crime, four guilty men, and the stories that define us, like John said, is it's out on September 23rd. You can find that book anywhere you find books. And not only that, one thing I didn't talk about, I found out there is also an audio book that will be released with it. Um, Part
Yeah, yeah. I got to listen to a little bit of it. Megan had played it to me. My publicist, she had played it to me over the phone. So, I mean, this guy is amazing. Just like I don't engage with books that way, but for folks who do, he nailed it. Like just in terms of it's so captivating just to listen. And a little just unusual to listen to your own words read back, but I got a little dose of it. And if that's your thing, Celadon, the publisher, hired this guy, and he's really the best in your business. So really grateful for him and for the audio book. Yeah, that's your thing. It's definitely out there. Tragedy and True Crime and on audio. Grab the book, wherever.
Yes, definitely. So, yeah, John, again, thank you for sharing your work and sharing your experiences and perspective with me again today. I do really appreciate it as always. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure thing, Patricia. Thank you.
You got it.